I'm a registered sports nutritionist and I've been reviewing your 70.3 and Ironman race nutrition plans that you sent in to me. And in this video, I'm going to be going through my live feedback on them. You'll see how I approach these race nutrition plans, what sort of things that I focus on, and how you can use these real examples to help with your own race nutrition prep. And if you're new here, then hey, my name's James. I'm a sports nutritionist and I work with amateur and pro triathletes to help them train and race better, improve their recovery, and do all of this in a healthy fashion. So let's get stuck into these plans then. From the notes, I think that some of these have already happened, and if they have, then hopefully it just gives you some ideas or things to work on for next time. But if you're one of the ones where your race is coming up, then fingers crossed I can help you to nail your race nutrition. Alright, so we've got our first plan to analyze, which is for a 70.3. So they've got 30 grams of honey immediately before the race, and then they're looking to use about 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour using a combo of orange juice and water, which is pretty interesting. And I can't say I've actually heard anyone do that before. I actually had to check the carb amounts here for the orange juice to make sure that it works out right, and it does pretty much. So yeah, nice. So in terms of carbohydrate amounts, this is great. If you can take 90 grams of carbohydrates an hour and keep that up and not get any tummy problems, then that is awesome. My main issue here is that actually there isn't much sodium in your fluid. So most commercial orange juices contain something like 1 gram of salt in the amount of orange juice that you've put in. So that would only be around 400 milligrams of sodium. So this might differ, and perhaps you haven't actually told me that you've added salt, but this is something that I would look at. So I would consider either additional sodium via table salt, or I would look at consuming specific sodium capsules to help bump that sodium intake up. Because at the moment you'd be consuming about 2,100 milliliters of water, but you'd only be consuming about 190 milligrams of sodium per litre. And I would recommend at least 500 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid. Now in a 70.3, this might be okay because you might be able to get away with it, because depending on how long it takes you, how well hydrated you are beforehand, and the conditions, hydration isn't quite as important. Now for most people it still is, and as I say, I would recommend optimizing that sodium amount just to make sure you're in a really good range. The run strategy looks good to me if you're happy to drink honey throughout the run. And at the run point, I generally don't worry too much about sodium as long as you have done well beforehand. So yeah, this looks good. Okay, on to the next one. And there's not loads of information here, but if you can do this, then awesome. You've got a good amount of carbs, you've got a good amount of fluid, so that's looking really strong. I'm going to guess this intake is actually on the bike rather than the run, because I think trying to hit 85 grams of carbs an hour on the run for most people just isn't realistic, especially towards the end of a race where your tolerance to be able to absorb nutrition and your actual capacity for carbohydrates is much lower. But if you can manage that on the run as well, then fantastic. Not much to say about this one otherwise because you haven't given me lots of info, but if you can do this and you can manage something similar on the run, then it looks like you're probably in pretty good shape. However, the only other thing to mention here is that you haven't said how much sodium is in your carb drink mix, and kind of similar to that last plan we just went through, I would want to make sure that your sodium intake is hitting that minimum 500 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid threshold, just to make sure that you're staying well hydrated throughout your race. So on to the third plan here, and this person is doing a full distance Ironman. They've said before the swim they're having a Morton 320 drink. Would like to know timeframes, because are you essentially having this for breakfast, or is this a pre-swim snack? So are we talking kind of 15 or 30 minutes before your race? If that's just before your race, then that's quite a lot. If you've practiced that and you can tolerate it, then great. If not, I would just be saying how long before your race are you having that. So if it's breakfast, then that might be okay. I usually suggest in the last 90 minutes or so to stop consuming fluid or gels or any other sports nutrition until a pre-swim snack, which is usually in the 15 to 30 minutes before you start. So then you've suggested during the bike you're going to have 6 Morton 320s and 2 Morton bars, so around 95 to 110 grams of carbs per hour. And this is great if you can manage that, because that's a really good amount of carbohydrate that you're going to be taking in, well within or kind of at the upper limits of race nutrition guidance. So if you practice that at race pace and you can tolerate it, then fantastic. The only thing I would say is just to make sure that you are keeping up with a good amount of fluid here, because you're going for that high carbohydrate amount, and it's worth making sure you're drinking well to keep on top of it as well. And generally, I find with triathletes that they absorb their nutrition better if they are drinking a good amount of fluid with it. So I presume you're probably going to be doing it just as per the Morton ratios, and if that is the case, then that should be good. Now, again, we're going to come back to sodium here and just say, have you considered it fully? Because Morton products generally don't contain that much salt and therefore sodium. And so if you're not already, you can bump your sodium intake up, and there's 2 main ways that you can do this. So the first is that you can add table salt directly to your drinks bottles. So I spoke to Morton about this, and you can add up to 1 gram of table salt, which is 400 milligrams of sodium per bottle, without disrupting their formula. So that really does give you a good boost of sodium and can really help with your sodium intake and managing hydration over the course of the race. Your other option is to use sodium capsules, and you can just use those. You'll have to kind of plan it out and work out how much sodium you want to consume as an extra, and then just take that over the course of the race. But I would really say that certainly over a long distance triathlon, and it might depend on your individual sweat rate and your conditions, but actually making sure you are getting enough sodium in and probably bumping it up a little bit would be a good option. So then we're onto the run, and you said you're going to be having 2 Morton 60s per hour plus Gatorade drink every single aid station. Now, I'm going to guess that you meant Morton 160s per hour, and if you can do that, then that's brilliant, because that would be 80 grams of carbohydrates per hour, which, yeah, is fantastic for the run leg. And to be honest, if you were managing to consume 95 to 110 grams per hour of carbs on the bike, then actually 2 gel 100s would be great too. So I think, yeah, as long as you practice that and you are tolerating it all, then amazing. Otherwise, you probably could bring the carbs down slightly on the run, because you've had so much on the bike as well. And then that is just going to still give you a really good amount of carbohydrates, but it's just reducing the risk that you're actually going to struggle later on because you've just tried to consume too much carbohydrate and later on into the race. The other thing that you've said here is that you're having Gatorade at every aid station, and that is good. I think 2 things here come to mind for me. The first is that for non-European events, it's going to be Mortal Hydration rather than Gatorade, unless your Ironman is still providing Gatorade. So I would double check that, because the amount of carbohydrate and sodium in Gatorade is much different to that of Mortal Hydration. So I would go back through your race nutrition plans, make sure that you are having enough carbohydrate and sodium after that change and you're still hitting your targets. The other thing is that if you were having 2 Morton 160 gels plus Gatorade, that is going to be a lot of carbohydrate overall. And again, just make sure that you really have practiced that and that works for you, because otherwise I could see that you might get to the end of the race and have some stomach issues by over consuming carbohydrate during the run. But it does sound good overall, so good luck with it, and I hope you break your PB. Alright, we're on to the next plan, which is someone who's got a couple of 70.3s under their belt, and they're trying to refine their nutrition strategy for the 3rd one coming up in a little bit. So, quite a lot to say here and dive into it, and I like this because there's more detail and more things for me to get into. Good idea about the carb loading and making sure that you do it and trying a different strategy, especially if you're not getting on well with the traditional foods. Firstly, make sure that you do practice in advance. So if you're trying a different protocol, you're trying different foods, it's all a bit different. Make sure you try it, and I would say do it before a big training day or a big training weekend. So I'd say definitely just make sure that you practice this in advance, because if you're doing a different nutrition protocol, you're trying different foods, you want to make sure that it is still working for you. So pick a time where you know you're going to be doing some race pace efforts, and it's going to be a longer one. So yeah, longer bike ride, maybe into a run, just so you really get a feel for it and test it and make sure it works. Also, you might want to check out the video interview I did with Holly Soto. She's a dietitian and she specializes in gut troubles for runners and triathletes. And we talked about the low FODMAP diet and how it can really help some people who struggle with the classic carbohydrate rich foods, especially in the carbohydrate loading period. Some of those foods can cause stomach problems, even though they might typically be seen as the right sort of ones to go for. So you can find that on my channel, really worth a watch. And really that actually links to what you've mentioned here, because you said about struggling with stomach issues during the race, and that is very common, and it's hard to give exact advice because there is so much to dive into, but it might all be linked, and we'll come back to this, but I think you need to be a bit more analytical and kind of really go in depth with everything. In terms of your race nutrition, if you've had trouble at 90 grams of carbs per hour, then I would definitely say it's sensible to scale it down a bit and try and work upwards. Now, regarding the sodium intake, this really depends on the amount of fluid that you're consuming rather than just the numbers itself. So you mentioned 600 to 1000 milligrams. That's kind of meaningless in the context of sodium must be considered in milligrams per litre of fluid and not just in isolation. So this really might feed into why you've had trouble either feeling hydrated or feeling dehydrated. And you mentioned you're a salty sweater. So I think you really need to revisit the sodium content that you're consuming here. So I would suggest looking at how much fluid you're planning to consume over the course of the race, and then working out how much sodium is going to be in that, because from that you can then work out your sodium milligrams per litre of fluid, and this is the super critical number. So the normal advice is, and I mentioned this earlier, is at least 500 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid. But if you're a super salty sweater or you're struggling with hydration, you're in a hot environment, then you might need to go up to 2000 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid. Now, most people don't need to go that high, but just to give you an idea of the sort of range that we're talking about, and how actually if you dig into this a little bit more, you might really be able to unlock some of the issues which might be holding you back in your racing. So then we're onto the run leg, and I think, again, I just kind of revisit this a little bit, because if you fuel well on the bike, then you can have a little bit less carbs on the run. And so you could try something like a Morton 100 gel every 30 to 40 minutes. And this might help because you would still be getting a reasonable amount of carbohydrate, but you're going to be reducing the risk of having too much carbohydrate and then actually coming up against stomach problems later on during the run. So that might be worth thinking about in trying to just have a bit more on the bike and earlier on to give yourself time to digest and absorb it, and then tapering off towards the end of the race. But you also mentioned that you seem to get on well with the Torque gels, so why not just use them on the run instead of the Morton ones? Because if you get on with them, you enjoy them, whatever it is, then stick with that. I usually say if you can, then stick with it. You know, you could put them onto a race belt, just have them in your tri-suit, and actually over a 70.3 and a half marathon, you can easily carry everything that you need for you during the run. So I would definitely consider actually whether you want to use Morton gels or just stick with the ones that you know already and actually get on with. So yeah, I think overall the plan is good and you're clearly putting some effort into it, which is fantastic, but I think you just need to be a bit more analytical about it all. So I would go back through it, really nail down how much fluid you're consuming, what your sodium content or sodium intake is per litre of fluid, and just try and get into the numbers a bit and make sure you're hitting that guidance that I've already mentioned. I think this might be key for feeling much better during your race and reducing that risk or the frequency that you've had stomach problems. And I think you'll really benefit from it, especially remember to check out that video from Holly and go through some of the low FODMAP stuff, because that might help you too. You can also check out my Ironman Nutrition Mastery Workshop, and there's a link in the description and comment section of this video to that. That's my 90-minute workshop where I go through everything that you might need to know about 70.3 and Ironman race nutrition. So we're covering the carb loading period, the pre-race breakfast, the snacks, and specifically how to fuel during the race. There are customizable templates for you to use, and you can really easily see the sodium, carbohydrate, and fluid amounts that you're taking, how it fits to the recommended guidance, and it can really help you to just hone in and perfect your race day nutrition. So go and check it out. It's had heaps of great feedback, and I'm sure it will help you too. All right, another plan to get into, and I like this because I can just get into a bit more and be slightly pernickety here. So going to talk about breakfast first. You've said some sourdough toast with jam 2 hours before the event with a cup of tea. So that is fine, no real issues with that. But I would say just double check how many carbohydrates you're actually consuming there, because if that's just a slice of toast and some jam, that might not actually be that much in the way of carbohydrate. And I usually recommend at least 1 gram of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight in your pre-race breakfast. That might be up to 4 grams of carbs per kilo of body weight, depending on how long before your event you're actually going to be eating. But I think there's potential there that you might be slightly low on carbs and could probably bump that up a little bit. You could use a calorie tracker app there or just the packets, and just make sure that you are getting enough carbs. Your bike and run nutrition generally look good, although I can't be 100% sure because you haven't said what your quantities are of carbs or sodium or exactly how much fluid you're going to be drinking. But I think it seems like you're probably in the right ballpark. I think just make sure that you are hitting at least 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour and 500 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid, but you should be in a pretty good ballpark. So yeah, not much else to say there. You are looking pretty good. I would just double check the numbers, and as you haven't mentioned whether you're having Morton 100s or 160s, just make sure you are in those optimum ranges. Now we're on to another 70.3 race nutrition plan, and I really like this one because there's some interesting little bits for us to get into and see if we can just generally improve your overall carbohydrate intake and your race nutrition. And although they might seem like small changes, they might really benefit you in your race. The first thing to talk about is your pre-swim snack. Now, I'm always really cautious about having things like dates and prunes and other high fiber fruit before a race, especially if you're someone who struggles with stomach upset. It might seem pretty minor, but optimizing here for reducing fiber, so having something like a gel or a drink instead, might be hugely beneficial for you. However, it isn't a huge thing, and if you've practiced this before and you tolerate it, then fine, that's great, but it might be something for you to work on. My other thing to comment here on is that actually one date is only about 15 grams of carbohydrates, and that's not really that much for a pre-swim snack. I would much rather you were actually in the range of 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates here. So actually you might want to consider having 2 or 3 dates to get that number much higher. But the interesting thing there is just to remember that as you have more dates, you're actually going to be increasing that fiber content more. And again, this might not be a problem for you, but actually if you do struggle with stomach upset or you haven't practiced it before, then you need to make sure that actually you tolerate that okay, because generally more fiber means an increased risk of tummy problems later in the race. Your bike nutrition looks good, similar actually to other plans where I've just said maybe consider bumping up your sodium intake within your Morton drink mixes that little bit because they are quite low on salt, especially if it's a hot day or you are a particularly salty sweater. And your run nutrition looks great too, so nothing really to pick up on there. And overall, you've got a really solid plan. It's great to see, but I think it could just use some little tweaks to just get it to that next level. All right, so there you have it, some of your plans analysed. If you want me to review a race nutrition plan for you, then head over to my website, link is in the description and comments section, and sign up to my newsletter. Through my newsletter, you'll get a chance to submit your plans to me, so go and get involved. But if you want some help now on how to fuel your long distance triathlons, then you should watch this video where I go through the crucial elements of race nutrition that you don't want to miss.